Hi. Today, I will tell 5 horror stories about infected by the dead. The culling. Ryan couldn't remember the exact moment when everything had changed. It wasn't a single event, but rather a slow, creeping horror that overtook the world. One day, people were just people, laughing, arguing, living their normal lives. The next day, it all collapsed. He recalled the sound of the sirens, the rushed announcements on every broadcast, and the panic in the streets. But none of it had prepared him for the horror that would follow. He woke up in the hospital. At least, that's what he thought it was. Hospital lights flickered, and the air smelled sterile, tinged with something else, something sour. But the floor was slick, like oil. No, not oil. Blood. Ryan sat up with a jolt, pain lancing through his head as his memories came crashing back. He had been part of a rescue team, one of many sent into the quarantine zones when the disease spread across the globe like wildfire. The infection, it wasn't a virus, it was something far worse, something ancient. The first symptom had been subtle, a fever, a headache. The affected would begin to groan, then violently convulse, their veins turning black as if their bodies were being drained of life. But the thing that made it unique, the thing that terrified doctors and scientists alike, was what happened after. Those who succumbed to the infection didn't die. They didn't stay dead. Instead, their bodies reanimated. Ryan shook his head, trying to clear his foggy mind. His hands trembled as he pulled himself off the bed, his foot sliding in the pool of blood that covered the floor. He stumbled forward, his body aching as he forced himself to focus. The walls were stained with something dark, human blood, but also something that shimmered in the low light. His stomach churned. The sound of something shuffling in the corridor outside froze him. Ryan's heart thudded in his chest. Another groan, the unmistakable rasping sound of death dragging itself through the hospital halls. With wide eyes, Ryan crept toward the door, trying to listen. He could hear the dragging of feet, the sharp breaths, too sharp, too raspy. Then, a loud crash, the sound of metal on metal. Without thinking, Ryan bolted. He tore down the hallway, ignoring the pain in his legs, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he rounded corners, each one leading him further into a maze of broken hospital rooms and abandoned equipment. Another crash, closer this time. He reached the emergency exit and slammed his palm against the cold, metal door. Locked. He cursed, pulling at the handle in desperation. Another groan echoed down the hall, louder now. There was no time. He turned back, searching for another exit. As he darted into a nearby room, the door burst open behind him, and a figure lurched in. It wasn't human, or it didn't look human anymore. Its skin was stretched and mottled, its eyes sunken and clouded over, a pale, sickly gray. Its mouth was open in a grotesque snarl, teeth jutting out like jagged pieces of glass. It didn't just want to kill him. It wanted to feast. Ryan scrambled backward, his back slamming against the cold, metal drawers. He reached for anything to defend himself, but his fingers brushed against something wet and sticky. A bloody scalpel. He grabbed it, twisting it in his hand. His heart hammered as he watched the thing stumble closer, its breath sickeningly close. He had no choice. He lunged forward, driving the blade into the creature's throat. It gurgled, thrashing as the blood sprayed across the room. But it didn't stop. The creature wasn't dying. It couldn't die. Ryan's hands trembled as the thing's hands clawed at his arm, its breath hot and fetid against his face. Then, with a sudden, grotesque twist, its head jerked back and the creature let out a howl that made Ryan's blood freeze. He didn't have time to think. He shoved the blade deeper into the thing's throat, the sickening crunch of bone giving way to the sharp sound of flesh being torn. The creature's body twitched and went limp, But Ryan knew it wouldn't last long. They never did. No matter how many times you killed them, they always came back. He pulled away, panting, eyes wild as he surveyed the room. Blood pooled beneath his feet, slick and dark, and the scent of death filled his nostrils. He had to get out. He had to find a way to escape before it was too late. But in the silence that followed, a thought began to worm its way into his mind. A thought he couldn't shake. What if they weren't just coming back? What if they were evolving? Ryan swallowed hard. The infection had started slowly, but now it was everywhere. People had become creatures. And worse, it wasn't just the dead who were infected. He didn't know how much time he had left, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay here. Not anymore. The infection was spreading faster than anyone realized, and it was only a matter of time before the dead and the living became one and the same. The colony. The world had been gone for months now. Caden's breath fogged in the crisp morning air as he stepped into the clearing, the rusted gates of the colony creaking in protest. He was used to the sound by now, just like he was used to the smell of sweat and stale food that clung to the survivors here. The colony was all that was left of civilization, if you could call it that. Inside the walls, they lived on the edge of sanity, fighting to stay alive in a world that had already slipped into madness. Caden's brother, Ethan, had been one of the first to show signs. At first, it was a mild fever, nothing out of the ordinary. The doctors had dismissed it as a passing cold, and Caden had believed them. But when Ethan's eyes started to cloud over, when his skin began to turn an unnatural shade of gray, that's when Caden knew. The infection had reached them. They had tried to keep it contained, tried to quarantine Ethan before he showed any signs of aggression. But the thing about the infected, it wasn't just the death that took them. It was the hunger, the primal, gnawing hunger that overcame them once they had died, that gnawed away at whatever humanity they had left. It wasn't long before the fever took Ethan fully. His body began to twitch uncontrollably, his joints popping in unnatural angles as his skin cracked and peeled away. The first time he attacked Caden, it had been with a ferocity Caden hadn't been prepared for. He remembered the feeling of his brother's cold hands gripping his throat, his teeth gnashing, eyes wide with madness. Caden had barely managed to fight him off, watching as his brother's body collapsed into a heap on the ground. But the worst part wasn't the fight. It was when Ethan had gotten back up. When he had come back, Caden had to kill him. A loud crash interrupted his thoughts. Caden snapped back to the present, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife strapped to his side. He couldn't afford to be distracted. Not now. He had seen the infection spread before, watched as it turned the living into mindless, violent creatures. But this time, it was different. It was worse. He pushed open the gate to the compound and stepped inside, the familiar sight of the survivors huddled together in the courtyard not giving him any comfort. They were all broken, eyes dull with fear, mouths dry with hunger. But most of all, they were afraid of what was coming, of what was already here. Caden had barely made it inside when a shout rang out from the edge of the compound. The others stiffened, their eyes flicking nervously toward the sound. A woman in the far corner was frantically pointing toward the trees that lined the perimeter of the colony. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice trembling. Caden didn't need to ask who. He could hear the shuffle of feet in the distance, the low growl of something unnatural in the air. The infected were close. And worse, they weren't just roaming anymore. "Get to the gate," Caden barked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. He'd been here before, fighting off the dead, watching the survivors fall one by one. But now, the infected were adapting. They were learning. A loud snap echoed through the trees, and suddenly, the infected weren't just walking. They were running. No longer the slow, stumbling corpses they had once been, They moved with an eerie swiftness, an unsettling coordination that shouldn't have been possible. Caden's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them appear from the shadows, their once human forms now twisted into something darker. They were smarter now, and they were hungry. A sharp scream pierced the air, and Caden whipped around to see one of the women in the group being dragged away by two of the infected. Her screams were cut short as the others lunged toward her, tearing into her flesh with ferocious hunger. The sight was enough to make Caden's stomach turn, but there was no time for weakness. "Move! Move!" he shouted, grabbing the nearest survivor by the arm and dragging them toward the barricade. The survivors scrambled in all directions, desperate to reach the safety of the compound's fortified walls. But it was too late. The infected were already inside the perimeter, flooding the area in droves. "Caden!" A voice shouted, and he turned to see a familiar face. Maya, a woman he had known for years, her face now gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. "We have to close the gate. Now." Caden nodded, but he was already moving, adrenaline coursing through his veins. They were outnumbered. They were outmatched. The infected were closing in faster than they could fortify the entrance. They wouldn't last much longer. Just as the gate was slammed shut, the first of the infected reached the wall, their nails scraping against the metal, their breath ragged and feral. But Caden knew it wouldn't hold. The infection was spreading faster than they could keep up. No walls would stop them. No weapons could stop them. They were evolving, adapting, and there was nothing left to do but survive. Caden stared at the mass of infected clawing at the gates, their twisted forms hungry for the living. He felt a cold dread creeping up his spine, the realization sinking in. The colony was a trap. They were all already dead. They just didn't know it yet. And soon, even the gates wouldn't be enough to keep them safe. The awakening. The sun had barely risen when Layla heard the first scream. It was sharp and terrified. An unmistakable cry of someone who knew their end had come. She shot upright in bed, her heart already hammering in her chest. It had been 2 months since the outbreak started, and in that time, she'd learned to sleep lightly, always ready for the inevitable. Infected didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves. They came without warning, without mercy. She grabbed the old, rusted pipe she used for protection and hurried to the window of the apartment. What she saw made her blood run cold. The street was a sea of bodies. No, not just bodies, things. Figures staggered across the cracked pavement, their limbs jerking unnaturally. Their eyes were hollow, their faces swollen and disfigured, twisted into grotesque masks of what they had once been. But Layla knew better than to think they were anything close to human now. They had been dead, and now they were waking up. The infection had started as a localized outbreak, but within weeks it had consumed the world. The dead didn't just stay dead. They came back, only to be driven by something deeper than hunger, something primal. Layla had lost friends, neighbors, and eventually, the world itself, to the infected. What had started as a fever, a little cough, had grown into something far worse. These were no mindless zombies. No, these things, these dead, were changing. Layla's mind snapped back to reality as another scream rang out from the street below, louder this time. Her grip tightened around the pipe. It was getting closer. Her apartment building was silent except for the occasional creaks of old wood and the distant sound of glass breaking as the infected began their march. The world outside had become a war zone, and this building was one of the last places in the city that still stood. But for how much longer? The infected were adapting. They were learning. Layla had witnessed it firsthand. They didn't just shuffle along mindlessly anymore. They had begun to show signs of intelligence. At first, it was subtle, a look in their eyes that seemed different, more aware. Then there was the way they hunted. It wasn't just random destruction anymore. They were organized, they hunted in packs, and they worked together. It was as if they were learning from each other. She'd once found an infected man sitting in front of a building's door, pounding on it rhythmically. Not out of instinct, no. It was like he was testing it, trying to figure out how to break in. And when it worked, when he saw that the door gave way, he turned and called to the others, like he understood what it took to survive. A few days ago, Layla had witnessed a group of them dragging one of their own into an alleyway. She had been too far to help, but she had watched as they tore him apart and fed. Not in the wild, animalistic way the infected used to, but with a sort of grim purpose, like they were taking turns. They were learning, evolving. Her apartment was on the third floor, and from the window, she could see the street swarming with the dead, gathering, pulling together in a grotesque congregation. They weren't moving aimlessly anymore. They were gathering in a way that made Layla's skin crawl. Suddenly, her phone buzzed, the harsh sound of an incoming message making her jump. She checked it. It was a text from her sister, who had gone off on her own weeks ago, trying to make her way to a rumored safe zone. They're different now. They're learning. I saw one open a door. Don't trust anyone anymore. Layla's heart skipped a beat. Her sister had been the first to notice the changes in the infected. She had sent frantic messages about the increasing intelligence, but this one, the last one, sent a chill down her spine. It was as if she knew something that Layla didn't, and it terrified her. But the warning had come too late. The infected outside weren't just congregating. They were communicating. Layla turned toward the interior of her apartment. She had to prepare. She had seen this coming. She had been watching the infected evolve for weeks now, waiting for this exact moment, the moment they would no longer be the mindless, slow-moving corpses they had once been. She had read somewhere, before everything fell apart, that evolution wasn't always slow, that some species could adapt in mere generations. But she never thought she'd see it firsthand. Her mind raced. Could they be figuring out how to open doors? How to climb fences? The thought made her breath catch in her throat. There was a loud bang from the hallway outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass breaking. Layla spun around and dashed to the door. She pulled the small, rusted metal bar across the doorframe and backed away, her chest tightening. The hallway outside was eerily quiet, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. For a long moment, nothing happened. She held her breath, her body tense, waiting for something to break the silence. Then, there was another bang, and another. The infected weren't just banging on the door now. They were testing it, trying different angles, different rhythms. They were learning. They were trying to get in. And with each failed attempt, the noise grew louder. The infected were like an army now, working together. With a sudden shock, Layla realized the worst possibility. The infected weren't after food anymore. They weren't hunting. They were trying to capture. The door gave way. In that moment, Layla understood. The infected had been watching. They had been learning. And now, they had the ability to adapt, to plan. She wasn't just going to be another meal. They were going to use her, just like they had used the others. The door splintered, and in the doorway, a figure stood. It wasn't like the others. Its skin was pale, but not as decomposed. Its eyes were too sharp, too focused. It tilted its head as it looked at her, and for a moment, Layla felt a spark of recognition. This one understood. With the last of her strength, Layla grabbed the metal pipe and lunged forward, aiming for the thing's throat. But the thing smiled, a jagged, twisted grin. And that was when Layla realized. The dead had finally learned how to think. The forgotten. The radio crackled to life, the static almost deafening in the otherwise silent bunker. Sarah's fingers twitched nervously as she adjusted the dial, trying to clear the noise, but it persisted. It had been 2 months since the outbreak, and every day felt like the last. In a world where every sound could mean the end, Sarah had grown used to the silence. It was the eerie kind of quiet, the kind that gnawed at your nerves and made you question whether the world around you was truly empty or whether something was just waiting to break the stillness. She leaned in closer, heart racing. Then there it was, a voice, weak and hoarse, but unmistakable. "This is Alpha Station. Are anyone out there? We found a way. They're adapting. We need help." Her breath caught in her throat. Alpha Station had been one of the last government research facilities still standing when everything collapsed. If they had found a way to control the infection, if they had discovered a cure or at least a method of defense, she grabbed the mic and pressed it to her lips. But before she could respond, the radio died again, the static overtaking the signal. "Damn it," Sarah muttered, slamming her fist against the table, but she couldn't let it go. Alpha Station. If they were alive, they might be her only hope. She glanced over at the small, makeshift map pinned to the wall. Alpha Station was located across the city, on the outskirts, beyond the ruins of the military zone. It was a dangerous trek, one she had avoided for weeks, but now the decision was made. She couldn't stay here, not with the infected creeping closer every day, not with the isolation slowly driving her mad. She grabbed her gear, water, rations, the knife she had scavenged, and the radio. She wouldn't take chances this time. She had to make it. She had to. The city outside was an oppressive wasteland. The streets, once filled with the bustle of life, were now empty, save for the occasional shuffling of infected moving in their unnatural, jerky gait. They weren't as fast as they once had been, but that didn't mean they were any less deadly. They were still capable of violence, of tearing apart anything they could catch. Sarah kept her head low as she moved through the shadows, avoiding the main roads. She learned early on that the streets were a death trap. The infected had begun to congregate in large groups, and their sheer numbers made it impossible to take them on head-on. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the ruins of the city. Every corner, every alley, every broken window made Sarah's heart race. She knew they were out there, watching, waiting. The infected had become more organized, more aware. But she couldn't stop now, not when she was so close. As she reached the outskirts of the city, the buildings thinned out, replaced by the skeletal remains of what had once been factories and military bunkers. The land here was scarred, the earth torn up by the wreckage of collapsed structures, and amidst it all, the distant silhouette of Alpha Station loomed. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she quickened her pace. She was so close, too close to turn back now. But then she heard it. A growl, low, feral. Sarah froze. The sound came from behind her, a rustling in the shadows. She whipped around, her hand instinctively gripping the knife, but there was nothing there. The wind picked up, carrying with it the stench of decay. The air tasted sour. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Another growl, this time much closer. She took a cautious step backward, her eyes scanning the surroundings, searching for any sign of movement. And then she saw it, a shape half hidden in the darkened corner of an old, crumbling building. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a leftover pile of debris. But then it moved. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It wasn't like the others, not the mindless, twitching infected that wandered in search of flesh. No, this one knew she was there. It moved with purpose, its head cocked slightly to the side as it studied her. Its skin was pale, stretched thin over its bones, but there was something different about its face. It was almost human, almost. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had heard rumors, whispers among the survivors about the evolved, the infected that had adapted, that had evolved beyond the base, primal hunger of their kind. She had thought they were just stories. But now, standing in front of her, was proof that the infection wasn't just changing the dead, it was changing everything. The creature moved again, closer now, its eyes locked on hers. Sarah didn't know how she knew, but she could feel it. This thing wasn't just going to attack her. It was studying her, as if it was learning. Her heart pounded as she backed up, her legs shaking. But the thing didn't move immediately. Instead, it tilted its head, like a curious animal trying to understand the human in front of it. And then it spoke. The voice was raspy, hollow, but unmistakably human. "You're not one of them." Sarah's breath stopped. The voice, it was her own. "You're like me. Like us." She blinked. Her mind struggled to process what was happening. But the thing wasn't wrong. The infection had changed her, too. It had changed everyone. She had survived this long, not just because of luck, but because she had learned to think like them, to move like them, to become one of them without fully becoming one of them. It was the only way to stay alive. The creature took another step forward. Its eyes glinted with a strange understanding. And in that moment, Sarah realized the horrifying truth. The infected were no longer just mindless predators. They were becoming something else, something intelligent. They were evolving. And in that evolution, they had found a new way to survive. And Sarah? She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was part of something new, something that had once been human, but was now something far worse. The world had changed, and now, so had she. The last rain. The wind howled through the cracked windows of the old church, carrying with it the scent of decay and ashes. Once a place of worship, the church now stood as the last bastion of humanity in a world that had turned against them. The walls, once adorned with stained glass, were now scarred by bullets and blood. The altar was a graveyard for the dead, those who had fought to the bitter end and lost. And in the center of it all stood Marcus, one of the last living souls in the city. The outbreak had begun almost a year ago, but it felt like a lifetime. At first, the infected had been just a strange, terrifying novelty, shamblers and screamers that stumbled across the landscape, attacking without reason. But Marcus had learned quickly that the virus wasn't content to leave things as they were. It was evolving, mutating, shaping its hosts into something far worse than mere zombies. At first, they moved slower, like marionettes with broken strings. But then, something began to change. The infected no longer staggered. They started to run. They began to communicate, to hunt in groups, coordinate their attacks. And worst of all, they started to learn. Marcus had seen it with his own eyes. He had watched as a group of infected tried to open a locked door. They didn't simply bang on it like mindless animals. They analyzed it. The way they touched it, the way they looked at the lock, the way they seemed to understand the mechanics. It was like they were testing the door's weakness, figuring out how to breach it. And when they finally did, the way they swarmed into the building, as if they knew exactly where the survivors were hiding, made Marcus's blood run cold. He had thought the infection was only a threat to the living, but it wasn't. It was a threat to everything. It wasn't just turning the dead into monsters. It was turning the world itself into a twisted version of what it had been. Now, the church had become the last refuge for the few survivors who had managed to hold out. Marcus wasn't sure how many were left. He hadn't seen another living person in days. The infected had become too numerous, too intelligent. It wasn't safe to leave the sanctuary anymore. And every night, he could hear them outside, scraping, clawing, muttering in that strange, guttural language they had developed. They were getting closer. But then, a sound broke through the silence, faint, but unmistakable. A knock. 3 short, sharp raps at the heavy wooden doors of the church. Marcus's heart stopped. The survivors never knocked. They just came in, desperate and broken, with nothing left to lose. The infected didn't knock, either. They simply tore their way in. So who was this? With a mix of dread and hope, Marcus stood up from his perch near the altar and slowly approached the door, his gun gripped tightly in his hands. The knocking came again, louder this time, followed by a soft voice. "Please let me in. I'm not one of them." It sounded human, desperate, but Marcus had learned long ago not to trust his instincts. Trust could get you killed. Still, something in the voice made him hesitate. He had to know. He had to be sure. He peered through a crack in the door, eyes narrowing as he tried to make out the figure in the darkness outside. And then, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a man. Or rather, it wasn't just a man. The figure standing there, tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes, was wearing a tattered military uniform. But the thing that made Marcus's stomach twist was the way the creature stood. It wasn't the usual slow, stumbling gait of the infected. No, this one moved with purpose, with calculated precision, like a predator stalking its prey. "Please," the figure whispered again. Its voice cracked but still unmistakably human. "I know you're in there. I'm not like them. I'm still human." Marcus could feel his pulse quicken, his mind racing. He had seen too much to trust anything anymore. Could this be one of the last survivors, someone like him? Or was it a trap? Was this one of the evolved? The infected who had learned, who had become more than just animals, who were now capable of deception. He stepped back from the door, listening carefully. The silence was deafening, but then he heard it, the unmistakable shuffle of feet, and the soft scrape of claws on stone. The infected had surrounded the church. It wasn't just the one outside anymore. There were more. They had heard the knock. They had followed it. They were adapting, learning, figuring out how to get to the living once and for all. Marcus gritted his teeth and turned back toward the door. He wasn't going to let them get him. Not today. He had fought too hard to survive, to give up now. He had seen what happened to the others, how they had fallen, one by one, to the evolving horrors of the dead, how the infection had slowly crept its way into every corner of the world, until there was nowhere left to run. But there was still one thing Marcus could do. He could fight. He could hold the line. He could. A loud, guttural scream erupted from the other side of the door, followed by a frantic, desperate bang. The figure outside was pounding on the door now, frantic, shrieking. "Help me. Please, let me in." The voice was no longer human. It was the voice of the infected, high-pitched, almost animalistic. The thing had been lying. It was one of them, one of the evolved. Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could make a move, the door crashed open, sending splinters of wood flying through the air. And in that moment, Marcus understood that there was no running anymore. The infected were not just mindless beasts. They were the future. The world had been overrun, not by the dead, but by something far worse. It was a new reign, the reign of the infected, and humanity's time had passed.